markets and limited government. Through our research and education programs, we challenge government overreach and advocate for free market approaches to public policy that free people to realize their potential and their dreams. Since 1987, we have been a champion for freedom for the residents of Michigan and beyond. From hot dog stands and food trucks, to parents seeking education choice, to workers exercising union rights, to overtaxed business owners and entrepreneurs fighting for a level playing field. With them and others, we work for a freer and more prosperous state. During months when the Michigan legislature is in session, we host a policy event series in Lansing called Issues and Ideas. But when the legislature goes on its summer recess, we host these events around the state in communities across Michigan. We are happy to be back here in Sterling Heights today. And now for today's program. While states in America's South and West are booming, Michigan's population today is smaller than it was 20 years ago. Blue Ribbon councils and Lansing politicians talk about the need to get Michigan growing again, but key indicators continue to show that our state spins its wheels and digs even deeper into the muck. Some believe Michigan is doomed due to its winter climate, but other cold weather states have found strategies to prosper. Today, we're pleased to bring you a discussion with several experts on the lessons Michigan can apply from states that are succeeding in attracting job seekers, families, and businesses. First, we have Michael LaFave, the Senior Director of the Maury Fiscal Policy Initiative at the Mackinac Center, where he has worked since 1995. He is perhaps best known for his scholarly work examining state economic development programs. His studies and frequent commentaries on the topic have earned him a national reputation as a respected critic of state and local government economic development policies. Next, Jonathan Williams is the Chief Economist and Executive Vice President of Policy at the American Legislative Exchange Council, where he works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for the states. Williams founded the Mackinac Center for State Fiscal Reform in 2011 and co-authors Rich States, Poor States, Alec Laffer State Economic Competitiveness Index with Reagan economists Dr. Arthur Laffer and Stephen Moore. Prior to joining ALEC, Williams served as staff economist at the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, authoring numerous tax policy studies. Jonathan is a Michigan native and a graduate of Northwood University in Midland. And finally, we have Michael Van Beek, the Director of Research for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He's authored several studies for the center, as well as analysis and commentaries that have been published in the Wall Street Journal, the Detroit News, Detroit Free Press, Grand Rapids Press, Oakland Press, and elsewhere. I will moderate a discussion between the three presenters for the next half hour or so and leave some time at the end for your questions. If at any point during today's conversation you have a question on the topic for one of our panelists, you will notice some cards like this and pens in the center of your table. Write your question on the card. One of our staff will pick it up from you, and I will pose them to the speakers at the end of the time today. I'll try to get through as many questions as time allows, but if we don't get to your question, all of us will be up front afterwards and happy to answer your questions individually. So the first question I have today, Michigan's population has been stuck for a generation and has significantly lagged the nation since the 1970s. Michael Fay, why do you think that is?
Well, there's a clear association between interstate migration and population growth and policies adopted by states across the country. Academics have been researching this question for decades. There's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of academic papers published in peer-reviewed journals on what constitutes determinants of interstate migration. I think the sweep of the literature would very clearly settle on economic freedom being important to increasing economic opportunity, and that's an inducement for people to move from one area to another. There are only a few ways you can increase population, and it's the interstate migration one that drives population changes the most. There's one particular variable I see come up in the literature a lot, and I think it's worth mentioning since there's been a change here in the last couple of years in Michigan, and that's the right to work variable that you see in a lot of academic papers. Labor market flexibility comes up a lot, and it's very important. Richard Vedder, an Ohio University economist, has said the great untold story of American migration in the 20th century is just how many millions of Americans have moved from non-right to work states to right to work states. And the 21st century has continued. From 2010 to 2020, 4.5 million of our fellow Americans moved to right to work states on net balance. That's not just a coincidence. It's not just sunshine driving that traffic.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Greetings from the land of make-believe in Washington, D.C., where I'm based now. As the great Ronald Reagan, one of my favorite presidents in my lifetime, always said, Washington's an island surrounded by reality. So anytime I get a chance to get off the island and back into reality, especially my home state of Michigan, I take the opportunity. So thank you to my friends at the Mackinac Center for hosting us. You know, in my work at ALEC, I've been around all 50 states multiple times over now, working with state legislators across the country and really trying to get to the bottom of this really important question. And, you know, I won't say a lot of positive things about the governor's plans today, but I will say at least she's asking the question around growth and what it means to be a growth state. Her solutions may be different than I think the solutions that work and the decisions that Mike is talking about in the literature that's out there. But one of the things that in our Rich States, Poor States report that I co-author every year we look at is just how many Americans are, as we like to say, voting with their feet and going from one state to another. And since the pandemic, obviously we have a new normal where employers are giving their employees lots more flexibility than used to be the case. And folks, we're not going back to the way that it was pre-pandemic, I don't think, the way that the workforce is working. And so that being said, all of these factors and why millions of Americans move from one state to another year over year, that issue is getting bigger and bigger, and it becomes a bigger reward for the states that get it right and a bigger penalty for the states that get it wrong. And if you're going to summarize, you know, our 18 years of research in Rich States, Poor States in a very succinct, even one sentence, is be more like Florida and Texas and less like California and New York. And there's no, it's not rocket surgery here, as Art Laffer likes to say. This is basic economics 101. You become a more competitive state. You keep taxes lower. You have a better overall business environment. You have more job creators coming to your state. Guess what? More people are going to want to come to your state. The number one reason, outside of the academic piece, we know based on survey data, the U.S. Census Bureau actually does survey work on this, and they ask people, why do you go and why did you leave one state and move to the next in a given year? And the number one reason why people give and why they leave and go is economic opportunity. They want a better quality of life at a lower cost of life, and that's exactly what we're seeing across the country. And so as the discussions continue around Lansing and states all across the country, states are competing with each other directly for this migration of individuals and businesses, and that's why it's so important to get it right when it comes to making Michigan a lower tax state, getting the labor piece of it right, and getting the regulatory piece of it right. Those are the things that matter the most.
Mike, what consequences has a stagnant population had?
He said, his question is, what consequences might the state's population stagnation have on Michigan? Well, I think they can be profound. If you look at just private and public income, from 2020 to 2021, 7,300 or so of our fellow citizens moved from Michigan to Florida on net balance. That's gross outflow minus the inflow from Florida. And they took $1.4 billion of taxable income with them. So that's money they're not spending in our communities on local goods and services and businesses, and that's money that's not taxed in any way to pay for true public goods that we need and that people like, and that also can induce moves into a state. Quality roads are still a thing. Our own state's Asset Management Council has said that we're still not putting roads together as fast as they fall apart, and yet every time somebody moves out, they take their money and their talent with them.
One other thing I would add to that is, you know, apart from all those really important elements, one little kind of known factor of this that should be common sense, but a lot of times we don't get to this, it's kind of a second or third order effect when it comes to government policy, and it is when people leave a state, it's not just the current income, it's the lifetime of income, because when they leave a state, they're not coming back generally. That's based on what we find in the research. So what does that also mean? It means that they're also taking their charitable contributions with them that support civic life, support their churches, their synagogues, the Boys and Girls Club, the YMCA, all those things that matter to the fabric of the community. Those individuals are now making those contributions in their new home state, not the state that they left. So one really recent example, some of you know Ken Griffin is the CEO of Citadel. It's a big money management firm that just left Chicago and relocated to Miami. So they're, first of all, Illinois is losing out on all the new income tax revenue. And of course, Florida is a state without a personal income tax, so they're not getting it, but they're getting all this new economic vitality. But based on the report that I saw on one of the Chicago outlets, Ken Griffin now, since he's moved to Miami, has given $300 million to charitable causes in Miami and not a dime to a charitable cause anymore in Chicago. So it's not just the revenue to the government and all the other positives you get as a growing state. That you get the charitable contributions and all those other things that sometimes we forget about that are just so important to communities.
Okay, apparently my microphone and that one won't work together at the same time, so I'm just going to try to project louder. Around this time last year, Governor Whitmer announced the creation of the Growing Michigan Together Council to advise her on specific policies to grow Michigan's population, including identifying a population goal by 2050. Last month, Governor Whitmer disbanded the council. Mike Van Beek, why didn't that report gain any traction?
Yeah, that's right. So they put out a report in December, and then shortly thereafter, Governor Whitmer disbanded the council. So really all we have from the council is this report. And it's unfortunate to report to you that there's not much of value in that report. I read it from every word. I don't recommend doing it. I wish I had that time back for more productive purposes in my life. It was really an example of severe groupthink. This was created by a council, a bureaucracy basically, that was made up of politicians and special interest groups and other insiders in Lansing. And so what you got with the report is a bunch of nice-sounding, rather vague policy goals, but without any real action plan for achieving any of those policy goals. So it said things like, we should make sure we have a great teacher in every classroom. Who would disagree with that? How do you do it? That's the question, right? So that's kind of what the report ended up being, and so I think that's one of the reasons why we don't hear much about it anymore, is because there's not much there. That's my offer to you, is to prevent you from reading this report. Just stay away from it. There's very little value in it, and you will probably very easily find something much more valuable to do with your time.
If I could just piggyback on that for a moment. The administration didn't support it much either. They had a couple of hearings, and the state's chief growth officer came in and sort of read from the product and didn't really back up any of the assertions that this will change our trajectory for growth if we adopt this particular policy with actual evidence, even though there's a great deal of evidence, as I've already mentioned, produced by academics with no dog in Michigan's fight. They just had to look to it. For fun, I wrote down the list of footnotes, and there wasn't a single academic study, or 3 academic studies mentioned, but not a single one supporting a particular determinant they were trying to follow. So, they want to start a program to subsidize the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Michigan. There just wasn't any studies involved that said we should do this because it's worked here, and these academics have debated it, and all the data says it will work. So it was really a word salad that recommended funding in 54 occasions, but didn't give real specifics on how to obtain it and use it in detail.
I would say, what we're seeing coming out of the radical progressives that are running Lansing right now is cognitive dissonance when it comes to looking at what it really would mean to grow a population. So they talk about the need to grow a population, which is a real need, but what do they do is they repeal right to work, one of the most important things to do to be a successful inbound migration state and a state that's growing jobs. And they also, deem that the income tax reduction that was clearly meant to be a permanent reduction in the personal income tax wasn't permanent. All the things you're not supposed to be doing if you want population growth, they're doing. And that's really the challenge. Now, if you were going to have a magic wand, if you gave me a magic wand for the day and say, how would you set up a population commission if you're going to have a real one that actually matters and you get to the bottom of what's actually the cause of the Michigan out-migration problem? Well, for me, I don't know. I'm kind of a simple guy. I think, what I would start with is, what are the states that are gaining population from Michigan? And what do they have in common? So you look at the states that are gaining the most from Michigan: Florida, Texas, North Carolina, the top in terms of the net domestic migration of Americans, in this case Michiganders, when they vote with their feet and go to another state. Those are the top three sources of inbound locations. So what do they have in common? Texas and Florida, two of the largest states in America, but also two of the states of the 9 that go without a personal income tax altogether. Making sure that you keep what you earn. It's your money at the end of the day. You don't have an additional state income tax liability. But then you have North Carolina, a really interesting case study where 10 years ago in our rich states, poor states economic rankings, North Carolina was middle of the pack. But what they did is, over a period of time, they created a flat tax. They went from a progressive income tax to a flat tax. They did some amazing things in getting rid of the state death tax, becoming more and more competitive, continuing to cut rates. And folks, a lot of people don't know this. Do you know what the business income tax rate is in North Carolina right now? 2.5% is the business income tax rate in North Carolina. And here's another one. Do you know what it's going to be in the next 3 years? We have somebody very smart in the audience. The North Carolina income tax under current law is going to 0 in the next 3 years. And that budget was signed into law by a Democrat governor, Roy Cooper, along with a Republican supermajority, who realized that is our ticket to get actually more revenue into the state. It's the latter curve, right? You tax less. A lot of times you actually get more activity and you get actually more revenue, where North Carolina has had massive surpluses this entire decade after dramatically cutting taxes. So I think those 3 lessons, you avoid a personal income tax, they're all right to work states, and states like North Carolina just keep the foot on the pedal in terms of cutting taxes and becoming more competitive.
Okay, so besides taxes, what does the research really show about ways that, what makes people decide where they want to live or work?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we asked ourselves when the governor announced that she was going to create this council, because we wanted to see, well, we knew that economists had been studying this issue for decades, and have done lots of very sophisticated studies, statistical work on what causes these kinds of changes, or what are the drivers that really impact state population. We commissioned a study with an economist who is a Michigan native, actually, who used to work at the Mackinac Center and now has her PhD in economics and is teaching at a small school in North Carolina. And she looked at over 100 academic studies on what drives state-level population growth. And what she found is that there are 3 things that, that most state policymakers can't really control. And those are birth rates, death rates, and international migration. Those are 3 factors that impact the state's population. But state policy doesn't really have a large impact on any of those rates. What the state can do is have an impact on what we've been talking a lot about, domestic migration, movement of people from state to state. And that's why the state level policies are really important and have a big impact on that domestic migration that happens between the states. And what most of the research suggests is what lots of us already know, and that is the states that offer more economic opportunity, that have more economic freedom, that have fewer regulatory barriers to be an entrepreneur or to start a business or expand a business. Those are the states that are growing the fastest. They attract the most of that domestic migration, and that's why we see states like Texas and Florida and North Carolina growing while Michigan is floundering.
I can just add to that. she looked at 100 academic studies you find in peer-reviewed journals, but there's some top quality research that doesn't make its way into the journals. In 2010, we asked Michael Hicks of Ball State University to do a determinants of interstate migration study for us. And he looked at all the evidence and built a statistical model to try to identify the most influential factors. And in his study, the tax burden in Michigan came out to have the highest response. And he found and reported that for every 10% increase in the differential between personal taxes in Michigan and states with whom we compete, an additional 4,700 of our fellow citizens leave the state. Now, like with right to work, nobody wakes up and goes, oh, North Dakota, they have lower taxes, therefore I'm moving. But it's one variable in the important equation. In 2007, the personal income tax in Michigan was raised by 11.5%. So if you take his numbers, that's possibly 80,000 people who moved out of Michigan as a result of that one tax increase. But perhaps worse, and something we need to think about in the last couple of years, even if our income tax rate stays the same, 20 plus other states have recently, since 2020, cut their own taxes. So the gulf is widening even if we do nothing. And that's going to have an unfortunate impact on our outflow of people to other states.
Many argue that recent policy changes have made Michigan even more unattractive and uncompetitive. Which are the policies that will have the greatest impact on Michigan's ability to attract jobs and people?
This is probably a through line you're going to hear a lot, but our status, or lack of status now as a right-to-work state is probably going to have a big impact. The Mackinac Center wanted to try to be the first in the country to measure whether or not there was an economic development impact from adopting right-to-work over 10 years ago now. And so we looked at border counties. We thought that that's where the impact would show up the most and first, and in manufacturing, for instance. There's other sectors we looked at. So we looked at these states, we collected data from 3,000 counties, and the states that adopted right to work from 2000 or after, we found an increase in the share of manufacturing employment in the counties on a right to work state side of the border, whereas the state without the right to work law didn't enjoy that benefit. Even when there wasn't an increase, we did see a realignment, so say a realignment away from Ohio to southern Michigan and Indiana.
I'd say the other, I was going to mention it on the last piece because it plays in really well to what Mike was just saying, is of all the things to look at, in rich states, poor states, for instance, we look at 15 different categories of things that we know matter for economic growth based on the research, based on our Laffer's 50 years of studying this. But one of the things, if you're going to single out some of the most important, right to work is clearly one, but the other is the personal income tax. I mean, you look at the 9 states, as I was talking about Florida and Texas, those are just 2, but the 9 states without personal income taxes, when you compare their growth versus the growth of all the states with income taxes, an incredible growth premium associated with that. And why is that? Now, one of the reasons is that the vast new amounts of new jobs being created in the United States, and this has been the case now for probably well over a decade, has been the net new jobs created in the United States are being created by small business. And where does small business pay on the income tax? They don't pay the corporate income tax. The vast majority of them, like 99% of small businesses pay on the individual side of the income tax. So when you're talking about reducing the personal income tax, you're not just reducing it for wage earners, you're reducing it for those business owners, the entrepreneurs, the startup companies, the companies that are making a real difference in growing jobs across the United States. And so when you look at it, why is it the growth magnet that it is? It certainly attracts some of the big millionaires and billionaires moving across state lines, people like Ken Griffin moving his charitable contributions like I just talked about. And it's also that important first step of the business cycle, that startup business, that mom and pop, those businesses that were hurt during the COVID lockdowns of your governor and governors all across the country. Those are the businesses that took it on the chin, and those are the businesses that are actually going to lead to growth, and we're seeing lead to growth in states across the country.
There's one other element here that I think is important, not a particular policy, but a dynamic that has been emerging in Lansing, which is we go back and forth between different policies frequently now. So that creates uncertainty about what the state's policies or tax rates are going to be for the future, and that's really harmful for attracting businesses as well, because businesses and entrepreneurs, and if they're going to invest in the state, They want some level of confidence, some level of certainty about what the future is going to look like. And this is not really a Democrat or Republican issue. It's just the dynamic of moving from party to party, flipping the legislature and governor back and forth, and then the new administration undoes all the stuff that the previous administration had done. That's a real challenge that Michigan needs to overcome as well.
Over the last year and a half, the governor and legislature have allocated billions of dollars toward company-specific subsidies, with several billion more awaiting legislative action when they return after the summer recess. Will that do any good?
Not only do I not expect that it will do good, I think it could actually do harm. There's not just directly, but in terms of opportunity cost. There's a great study a couple of economists out of North Carolina did. They looked at 2,400 economic development deals across 35 states, and they tracked the employment at the companies that had been subsidized and compared them to like companies that had not been subsidized. And they concluded that for large corporations, the incentives resulted in what they call starkly negative employment impacts. Those firms that had not been subsidized actually added payroll at a higher rate than those that had been subsidized. So it could have an actual negative impact right there. But there's also the opportunity cost. If you spend a lot of money picking corporations as winners as opposed to losers who didn't get subsidies, then you're not spending it on other important public sector goods or cutting taxes for everyone instead of a favored few. Since 2023, January 23, there have been $4.4 billion in corporate handouts authorized by the state legislature. And there's as much as $3 billion more waiting in the wings when the lawmakers return to Lansing after their summer break that they may approve. So in one hand, I think they're repealing and avoiding good public policies that have their own positive economic development consequences in favor of these demonstrably bad ones. It's not just my observation. There's scholars from all over the country, no dog in our fight. We're finding the same, coming to the same conclusions.
I just reiterate everything Mike said. It's 100% right when it comes to our experience working across states as well. There's two ways to compete. You compete versus the free market way of lower taxes and less regulation for everybody in a fair business environment, to Mike's point, a predictable business environment to make sure that the rug's not getting yanked out from under you after you make $1 billion investment in the state. Or you go kind of the cronyism route, which is the picking winners and losers. Generally, we find the biggest defenders of that approach are the states with the highest tax rates to start with, the ones that have to make up for the difference, because they realize, whether they like it or not, that as Mike pointed out, we've had nearly half the states dramatically cut income taxes over the last 3 legislative sessions. You've got to stay up with them to try to stay in place to attract businesses and keep your people in the state. The question is, how do you go about doing it? The long-term research shows you definitely don't want to follow that approach of high taxes for everybody and then the politically connected in a state capital like Albany or Springfield or Sacramento gives the government benefit. It just doesn't work that way.
Can I just add that taking a step back from that and thinking about the big picture here, why does Michigan why do Michigan public officials feel like they need to spend $4.4 billion to entice companies to stay in Michigan and to expand here? There's a reason for that. Because the fundamentals are not right? The underlying rules and the environment is not sufficient. And so we have resorted to having to bribe companies to stay in Michigan. We should instead focus on the fundamentals and fix the environment first. And then we won't have to bribe companies to expand and be here. They'll want to come here voluntarily.
Mike, one more thing. I just want to piggyback on that last thought there. Timothy Bartik is an economist with the Upjohn Institute in Kalamazoo, and he's written a study. And he finds that between 75% and 98% of all corporate expansion, relocation, or retention deals would have happened without the incentive. So it ends up being just a windfall for these corporations, and we're the ones who have to pay the price.
As a reminder, if you have questions for any of our speakers, I see a few cards being filled out across the room. When you have the question and written it on the card, please hold it up. Michelle will come by and pick it up from you and get them to me. And when we finish our conversation, we'll get to a few of those. Mike Van Beek, how is Michigan's population and reputation across the country affected by our COVID response?
Well, I hope not too negatively, but I fear that it would be hard to imagine that not having a negative impact. The Bureau of Labor Statistics surveyed businesses across the country and asked them if they were forced to close during COVID. And a larger portion of businesses in Michigan answered yes to that than any other state in the country. So you could argue that Michigan had Governor Whitmer's lockdowns were the most severe in the country and closed the largest amount of economic activity. That certainly sends a bad signal to the rest of the country. And to my earlier point about predictability, obviously having your business forced to close is maybe the most draconian and unpredictable kind of environment you could be in. So I hope that we've learned the lesson from lockdowns. The amount of research that's been done since those is very clear that they don't work to stop the transmission of an easily transmissible virus, right? So they're all pain and no gain, basically. So I'm hopeful that we won't commit that mistake again.
Jonathan, you mentioned Florida, Texas, North Carolina as states that we're competing with for jobs and population. I would add Tennessee to that list. You also mentioned taxes as a big difference between those four states, Tennessee also being a no-income tax state. What other policies are they doing that makes them attractive relative to Michigan?
Good question, and I probably add in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and a few others that I think make sense for the out-migration, right? And it's a little bit sensitive. Whenever I go to Columbus during football season and mention I'm a Michigander, it gets a little testy real fast there. And I could always used to be able to say, hey, at least Michigan's a right-to-work state, you're not, but now I don't even have that going for me. We do have a scoreboard, though, after this last year, so that worked out. I think it's, all the things we've been talking about. The other thing I would say, Michigan's had a really unique experiment and positive in many regards, although it's been diluted, I think, as Mike has written about over time, is looking at things to limit the growth of property taxes. What the Headley Amendment, certainly here is in Michigan, a great example of one that started out very strong, has gotten weakened over time. One of the things that Tennessee does is something called truth in taxation, something that we are very high on at ALEC, which is getting to the bottom of, anybody have this issue where your assessments have gone through the roof and your local elected officials kind of congratulate themselves and say, we held the line on property taxes this year, and you look at your bill this year versus last year, and it's a heck of a lot higher this year than it was last year? It happened to me, and my local officials in Northern Virginia gave themselves a nice pay raise, said we held the line, didn't raise your property taxes, and I was like, how is it that I'm paying $1,000 more this year in property taxes for my townhouse than I did last year? And that, of course, gets to the heart of this dishonesty problem around property taxes. There's a couple of pieces to that equation, and yes, they didn't raise the rate, but they allowed the assessment to go up, and then they gouged you and pocketed the difference, right? They're not being honest with us about that. And so states like Tennessee, and we have 4 or 5 states around the country now have adopted our ALEC model, truth in taxation, to say, if you're going to do that, and if you're going to collect more money than you did the year before, folks, just be honest about it. Tell us about it. Send us a piece of mail saying you're going to raise our property taxes, have a public hearing, and then make the local government officials go on record and vote, yes, we're going to raise your property taxes, whether it's assessment-driven or rate-driven. Because until we get some honesty around that, there's going to be this huge desire for the big spenders at the local level of government in a lot of localities to continue to go to the state capitals or to Washington, D.C., asking for money to help reduce the problem when it's they themselves are the ones causing the problem with big spending at the local level. So that's something that Tennessee does very well, and it's something we hope the states all across the country adopt, because what's gone on over the last 3 years since the pandemic with assessments, people are getting taxed out of their homes, right? And it's not fair whatsoever for people on fixed income to see what's going on in their homes. That's something that's a travesty, and we got to get to the bottom of it.
When one brings up Michigan's stagnant population and unwise policies, the common response that I hear a lot is, well, people just don't like cold weather. It can't be that simple, can it?
No, it's not at all. Weather is a variable in the equation. But when I hear people say that, I often say, well, the first half of the 20th century, we had to beat people back at our borders. Michigan was much more of an opportunity state than it was back then. The personal income tax wasn't born in Michigan until 1967. And of course, you have cold weather states like Utah, Idaho, and Colorado that are in the top 10 economic growth states by a couple of measures. In fact, I think Utah and Idaho appear high up in the number 1 and 2 in the ALEC index that comes out every year. So with respect to growth as measured by state gross state product, Idaho from 2020 to 2023 had a more than 14% growth rate. It was number 5th growth rate in the nation. Michigan was, I think, 28 to 9%. If you measure economic growth in terms of job creation, I think Utah was number 1, Idaho was number 2 at 13% and 12% respectively. Michigan was 36th with 1.2% growth. So major difference. We have to look to states like, where people are moving, where economic growth is occurring, and ask what policy decisions are they making that we're not.
It's one that the folks that don't like to acknowledge what we're talking about today would like to just say the only reason why people move is for the weather. And if that's the case, well, California would be booming instead of losing. California, folks, has lost more than 350,000 people on net in the last 12 months alone under Gavin Newsom's high tax, high regulation regime. They've gone from a massive surplus with all the Biden bucks floating around Sacramento and state capitals to having a tens of billion-dollar budget deficit. Just this last week, you may have seen this, the Chevron Corporation, one of the largest corporations in America, decided to move their headquarters from San Ramon, California to Houston, Texas. It wasn't for the weather they're going to Texas, let me tell you that. If you've been to Texas anytime recently and seen the triple digits. On the flip side of that, what Mike said is exactly right, where Utah and Idaho, number 1 and number 2 in economic outlook in our Rich States, Poor States report, but also some other cold weather states have done very well, like South Dakota over the years, New Hampshire, states like that. Utah, there's a lot of things. We could probably have a whole discussion on what Utah has done right as a cold weather state, but a state that has really been governed well, whether it's cutting taxes, reforming pensions, and getting that huge unfunded liability and future tax increase off the books of the businesses. But the one thing that outside of truth and taxation on property taxes, I was born in Utah, by the way. The other thing they did, which I think is existential, what's going on. If anybody sees just this last week, we surpassed $35 trillion of national debt. We're now at $35.1 trillion of national debt. Utah got ahead of that at the state level and said, you know what, we're not going to just blindly accept all these federal funds coming into our state, because guess what, they cost us more than they get us in the long term in a lot of cases. And so Utah's put together a whole commission to say, let's analyze all these federal funds coming to our state, say what we want and what doesn't work for our state. And then they have a contingency plan in place to say, if and when, I think it's the case of when, federal support goes away for state and local governments, what's the plan on keeping those programs going or having the private sector pick up or local units of government? And when you look at the bond rating agencies, one of the reasons why Utah has kept a AAA bond rating directly pointed to by the bond rating agencies is that they have that contingency plan in place to say when the federal deficit hits the point where it's unsustainable and funds go down at the state level, that state's going to be financially secure. So it's a great example, and I encourage you to check it out, Rich States, Poor States, all the years that they've rated number 1 for all 17 editions of our report, and those are just a few of the reasons why.
You just mentioned Utah as a cold weather state that's growing. I would add Idaho to the list. I was talking to somebody just at a conference a couple of months ago, and his hometown in Idaho is going to grow, it's going to double in population just within the current decade. Are there other examples of cold weather states that are growing, and why?
Yeah, I mean, those that we mentioned are kind of at the forefront, but I mean, I think, I added Montana as well. I mean, Montana just gained a 2nd congressional district. It's very rare for a state to lose a congressional district and then gain it back, especially when you only had the one. Montana, I believe, lost it in the 1990 census, just gained it back, and a 2nd district just was created. If anybody's been out to Bozeman, Montana, and that area is absolutely booming at the seams. They're worried about all the Californians coming in with their bad ideas, I think, and bringing the big government ideas with them. But that's a state that's done very well, and not a state that avoids the personal income tax yet. I think Governor Gianforte is going to be pushing for right to work and pushing for income tax elimination, or at least reductions over time. But one of the things that they've done, and I think Idaho's done very well in this regard as well, is tackling the regulatory burden of government. It's something that Governor Little and Idaho spent a lot of time, where I think you saw some of the biggest reduction in regulatory burden in Idaho of any state. And then you have the Montana miracle, as they call it, on reg reform and in housing policy as it relates to getting some of that supply side problem fixed when it comes to government regulations getting in the way of building new housing supply. Of course, that's a big contributor to housing costs becoming so unaffordable across the country.
Just want to drive his points home. Jordan Rappaport has published a study in a peer-reviewed journal called Moving to Nicer Weather. And he shows on that balance there are moves to nicer weather. He said that Michigan's Michigan's weather contribution to our inbound migration ran from 0% to negative 1.5%. So we have to overcome weather limitations with better policy.
Jonathan, your research on competitive states has highlighted the importance of tax policy. Next year, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, Trump tax cuts, are set to expire. How would the expiration affect Michigan taxpayers, and would Michiganders fare worse than the residents of other states, and why?
Well, it's something that I'm just kind of curious, out of show of hands, how many here are aware that every single individual side provision of the Trump tax cuts goes away at the end of next year? So you have a very informed crowd. I would expect no less from a Mackinac Center gathering. You follow this, but the vast majority of your peers out there don't. And I think they're in for a very rude awakening in our economy, which is obviously, depending on the day and looking at markets, we had that day last week, we were down 1,000 points in the Dow. We're teetering, folks, at the brink of potentially a pretty nasty correction or a crash. There's a lot of fundamentals that are deteriorating quickly, and I think the last thing all of us can take, our economy can take right now, is a massive multi-trillion-dollar tax increase, which is exactly what's going to happen if Congress doesn't agree to something. And folks, I don't know if you've spent any time watching D.C. lately. Congress isn't agreeing on a heck of a lot at all, regardless on the issue lately. And so there's a real threat that every single one of those individual provisions goes away. What does that mean? It means your rates are going up on personal income tax. It means if you have kids, your child care tax credits could be worth a lot less. Your standard deduction that maybe you've gotten used to taking in recent years instead of itemizing, that may be gone. I think there's 90% of Americans now use the standard deduction because of the Trump tax cuts. Makes it a heck of a lot easier to file and simplified. And that hated alternative minimum tax, the AMT, that was becoming a big problem for many middle-income Americans pre-2017, that comes back with a vengeance after being nearly phased out with those 2017 tax cuts. All those things happen if Congress doesn't agree upon something by the end of 2025. The other thing that's going to happen, and this is going to impact Michigan and states all across the country, is one of the provisions that was a little bit misunderstood, I think, in the Trump tax cuts, was the limit on the so-called SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction, that you could used to be able to unlimitedly write off the amount of state and local taxes you paid off your federal return, which on the face of it sounds good. Now it's limited at $10,000 a year. But the overall effect of that was Michigan and many other states were subsidizing through that system. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, and California were getting the lion's share of the benefits because they decided as a government choice, and that's their freedom in our system of federalism and these 50 laboratories of democracy, they want big government, high spending, and high taxes. My contention is if you want those things, God bless you, it may be the wrong choice for your state to be competitive, but you ought to be able to make that choice. Just don't ask for all of us to pay for it. And that's exactly what would happen if the Trump tax cuts go away. That subsidy to high tax states comes back. That's going to be a big bite on Michigan finances and for all of us subsidizing those high tax states.
And last, before we go to audience questions, if you could pick one policy to change to get people and jobs flowing back to Michigan, what would that be? Let's start with Mike Napier.
Yeah, I would say, and Jonathan has made a similar point, that state income tax is a very important signal. And so I would make a significant, real cut to the state income tax, and maybe even do something like North Carolina, like make a plan to eventually phase it out. That would certainly send a very clear message to businesses and job creators and entrepreneurs that Michigan is open for business, and we would be All the states around us in the Midwest would have an income tax, and Michigan would have a very small one, and maybe one that we could even roll all the way back to zero. And I'd also like it to be a very simple cut, not a fancy formula like the legislature tried last time, and then the Whitmer administration just nixed that. So make a real permanent cut.
Yeah, plus one to that, and I would say, get to the elimination, even if it's a longer period to get there, at least start down the path. I mean, we are really running the risk of falling behind by standing still, and we're not even standing still. Rates are going up, as we know, in Michigan, but any state that stands still in an era now that have half the states dramatically cutting income taxes to become more competitive finds themselves at a disadvantage. Being in Columbus, Ohio, being in Indianapolis recently. Indiana, they're going to reduce taxes and have their flat income tax under 3%. I think there's a good chance in Ohio they're going to have a 2.75% flat tax by the end of the next budget cycle. You combine that with Kentucky, that under current law, the personal income tax goes away with triggers in Kentucky. And you add that all together, Michigan needs to get the act going quickly on the income tax reduction and eventual elimination to be competitive. Now, how do you do that? That's a trickier part of the equation. Now, the key to being a no-income tax state, based on our research, is the 9 no-income tax states, the growth powerhouses that they are. The key to their success is they don't just rearrange the deck chairs on the ship and say, we'll have high sales tax or high property taxes. The key to their success is they balance spending reductions with tax reductions and do it in a responsible way. And they look at the results, and it's hard to argue with the results. The states without income taxes, the 9 states, spent about 50 to 60% less per person than the 41 states with income taxes over the last 10 years. Incredible reduction in real tax burden, but you got to do it through the spending side of the equation. As one of my favorite economists, Thomas Sowell, put it best, I think. The first law of economics is we have a scarcity of resources, right? We don't have everything we want. The first law of politics is to ignore the first law of economics. We got to pay attention to the spending side of the equation to get the taxes in control.
My through line again, 2023, the top 10 states in terms of population growth were all right-to-work states. Also, we haven't talked about this enough at all. Energy costs. Michigan has more power outages at a higher cost than our neighboring states. I think it was 13% higher than neighboring states. And there was a deal a few years ago where Ford said we're going to open in Tennessee and Kentucky a new manufacturing plants, and they specifically cited the energy costs. And Michigan wasn't even in the running, regardless of what incentives they were waving around.
We got about 10 minutes for audience questions. I think y'all just answered the first 2 I had picked out, which I connected together. If you replace income tax, if you eliminate income tax, what do you replace it with? And then is the cost of government that much lower in the states without income tax than Michigan? So basically replace income tax with spending restraint?
Yes, and depending on how quickly you want to reduce the income tax or get it to zero, you can do it over a period of time. I worked pretty extensively with the Speaker of the House in Mississippi. They passed, at least in the Mississippi House, it didn't get through their Senate. With Democrat support, they passed a bill to eliminate the personal income tax over a 10-year period in Mississippi, doing it exclusively through spending reductions and not letting government grow faster than inflation, essentially. We've got some great track records of states that have that, even in the state constitution. One of my personal favorites, Colorado. We were just there in Denver for our ALEC annual meeting a couple of weeks ago with 1,500 of our closest state legislative conservative friends. And it's a state that has done remarkably well, as politically it's gone from pretty red to purple to probably pretty bluish today. But one of the things that Colorado's had in the state's constitution now for over 30 years is something called the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, along the lines of the Headley Amendment and others. We call it one of the tax expenditure limitations out there. It essentially just says you can grow government, just don't grow it faster than the economy. Don't grow it faster than population plus inflation. So things like that, putting that in place, I think is an important step to keeping the tax burden under control, but actually getting a pathway to get to zero. Now, if you want to do it more quickly than a 10-year period, period, which some states probably do, you can match it with some other offsetting increases. Just be careful though. I mean, you get really into trouble where we saw it, during the Grand Home years, right? Where there was the service taxes that lasted a grand total of a weekend before being repealed. I mean, you have to be very careful how you look at that extra revenue. Personally, I think avoid the extra revenue and just focus on the spending side.
All right, first question card I'll go to on a new topic. What was the benefit to Michiganders to repeal right to work? Why get rid of it?
Why get rid of right to work?
Yes.
Well, there's really not an economic benefit. The power changed in Lansing. They had a different worldview on the value of right to work. But I was one of the first people in the committee room to testify against its repeal with a colleague, and we were not allowed to testify. I think there was only someone from the National Right to Work Coalition was allowed to testify on the don't repeal this bill. Everybody else came from the unions and other supporters who wanted right to work reinstituted.
One thing to add to that, and this is the silver lining in all of this, is in 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case called Janus, and in that case they ruled that public sector workers, state employees, public school teachers, all public employees have the right to basically have a right to work protection. That they don't have to be, they can't be forced to pay dues or fees to a union in order to keep their employment with a public employer. So even that makes right to work even less important in some ways, but it still sends a very bad signal to job providers. So Michigan's public employees still enjoy that right to work freedom, but our private sector employees now are subjected potentially to compulsory dues from unions.
Next question relates to Michigan's housing supply, housing shortage. Cities are building apartments left and right. Do you believe this is the cart before the horse, more housing to draw people?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, if the cities are subsidizing it, then yes, that can be an issue. Because you don't know if you're going to get the right mix at the right time and whether or not there's going to be demand for it. I will say that in the academic literature on migration as a function of quality of life issues, not specific ones like taxes or right to work, but sidewalks, the golf courses, amenities like art galleries, that sort of thing. They're looking at housing as a driving component of their variable to measure things because they argue that when housing costs a lot in an area, it could be a reflection of the desirability to live there. When it costs less, the desirability is less. In Traverse City, we like to say half the pay for a view of the bay. But that also translates into higher housing costs too, because so many people want to live there.
Including, I know of some friends of mine from my previous life in Texas. They bought a summer place in Suttons Bay, which is in your neck of the woods. Just one thought from my perspective regarding housing supply. Michigan does have an issue with the quality of housing supply. A lot of it in parts of the state tends to be older and in a relatively poor state of maintenance, especially you go 5 miles in any direction of the state capital in Lansing, you'll find all sorts of rundown houses that haven't been touched in 30 years. So there is a demand just for the existing population to have, I think, 1 million housing units over the next 10 years. The issue that you run into is the cost of local mandates and then also zoning restrictions on what you can build, where, things of that sort. We had an event on that. You can find that on our website. We hosted it a few months ago in Lansing, looking at issues regarding housing supply in Michigan. Is there any good news economically for Michigan?
Well, actually, yeah, from a policy perspective, we talked about the importance of lowering taxes, but if you look at a lot of rankings of states and how they do in terms of economic policies, we get high marks for our flat tax. So it may not be as low as we'd like, but the state's personal income tax and our corporate income tax is flat and relatively low. The Tax Foundation actually ranks us in the top 12, I think, And you see that get picked up in other areas like the Fraser Institute out of Canada also ranks Michigan's tax system and burden better than many other states. They rank our spending and our labor market much lower, but our tax system gets higher marks.
Yeah, I am an optimist by nature, and so I think that there's some really positives to look at. I mean, a lot of times I know, living through the Granholm years, living through single state recession period when I graduated from Northwood in '05, it was tough to be positive. And I think today we're in a much better shape than we were during those years because of all the reforms that were done. Even, notwithstanding the right to work discussion and losing that, some of these big picture issues like, the pensions. We've made some major progress on pension reform in Michigan that other states have not tackled, and so as a result, we're billions of dollars better off in terms of less unfunded liabilities than states have across the country. And what does that mean? If you get into the predictability issue, businesses are only looking at the current tax burden, they're looking at the expectation of the future tax burden. So when you look at the debt of a state, you look at the unfunded liabilities of the state, businesses look at those as future tax increases. And so Michigan's done some really good things as building blocks. If you can get some of these other variables right, you've got some very good fundamentals. The other thing Michigan has going for it is, frankly, Illinois is our best economic development partner. They continue to do all the wrong things. They're going to continue to spin off jobs and people. If they want to stay in the Midwest, they're not going to be looking to stay in Illinois. One time I talked to former Governor Mitch Daniels from Indiana, who is a great governor, by the way. I wish he had been president of the United States. Governor Daniels, I think, put it best. He was like, being next to Illinois is like living on the neighborhood with the Simpsons. It just doesn't get any crazier, right? Every time you think it's crazy, it just gets crazier in Illinois. So you got that going for us, best economic development partner in the Midwest.
There are also pockets of Michigan that are growing and doing things right. So on the west side of the state, Grand Rapids, and this is part, the one theory is that a lot of Chicagoans leaving Chicagoland and coming and moving up to West Michigan and Grand Rapids area. So Ottawa and Kent County in particular are growing very quickly. They're some of the fastest growing counties in the whole country. So there are pockets of success in Michigan. It's just we need to replicate that in more places.
Quality of life variable, miles of shoreline and distance to a body of water. That's a great advantage we have that maybe we're not taking advantage of to the degree that we should. We have so much water, we're pumping it out of our basements.
Yeah, you do, as someone who in past life, prior to 2018, me joining the Mackinac Center, I lived in Austin, Texas. I would emphasize quality of life as something that Michigan consistently ranks high. Another is housing prices. It was the major factor that got me to seriously convince relocating my life from Austin, Texas to Lansing, Michigan, because I looked at one of those cost of living calculators at the suggestion of a friend, and average housing price in Austin, Texas was $181 on the 100-point national average scale. My property taxes were going up 10% every year, and were going to go up because of the valuation increases. Lansing, Michigan was 35.9. Once I saw those two numbers against each other, it's like, tell me about Lansing. But yeah, so, my wife and I bought a new house in the Lansing area outside of the city a couple of years ago. And I know that house on similar location in my old neighborhood in Austin would cost 3 times as much. I had some friends from DC come out and it would be 5x. So I think I have time for maybe 2 more cards. How do we help point Michigan in the right direction in our personal lives?
Well, let me talk from someone who works with state legislators. I see we have Representative Steele with us, a good friend of ours. Good to see you, Representative. I'd say in your personal lives, be engaged. This is the most important thing. There's a lot of cynicism out there, right? Because of Washington being broken, because of Lansing under the progressive left being broken. But staying engaged, not giving up is such an important piece. But the other thing I'll mention, we're seeing Representative Steele here. We've got some people that are doing the right thing in Lansing a lot, and they're doing it, and they're fighting in extremely difficult conditions. The media, if we haven't checked lately, is not on our side. They're not reporting the facts coming out of Lansing. There's not a lot of people even covering Lansing anymore. And we've got hardworking men and women in the trenches every single day. And I fall into the same trap myself occasionally. It's easy to criticize, and legislators get a lot of, in some cases, well-deserved criticism on their policy choices. But let's not forget to also be in touch with our elected representatives when they're doing the right thing. To say, keep up the hard work. I know you're being outvoted right now, but we appreciate the kind of sacrifice that people put into real public service and being out there and spending so many nights away from their families and away from their kids and their grandkids and living lives that otherwise they would be living outside of the bubble in Lansing or all the state capitals across the country. And not to forget to recognize those people for that hard work and continue to have, hopefully have very good people want to go to Lansing to be able to begin this turnaround once again.
As someone who works with a lot of our elected officials in Lansing, I can tell you that Representative Steele is one of the good gals. So, last question I'm going to go to, I'll have thoughts on it, but I'll let you chime in as well. Why doesn't the current state administration listen to people who could really help put Michigan back on track for growth?
Well, they have their own policy preferences, and those that support those policy preferences, elections matter, and they won and want to implement them as to the degree that they can, to the degree that the Overton window allows them to. And so I think it takes persuasion, and we have worked with the current administration on issues where we did and could agree. Dave could probably fill you in a lot more on those details. So I think it's a matter of just different policy goals. It's been frustrating for me because I've reviewed mountains of evidence during my 30 years with the Mackinac Center, and I want to use it to persuade politicians. But I have found that their superpower is being impervious to facts.
Yeah, I would just elaborate that certainly the dominant worldview in Lansing over the last, especially 19 months or so, that you've had basically a one-party state operating in Lansing is anathema to almost opposite of what we are. It is very much about bigger government. It is about a lot of ambitious spending, higher taxes, preference for their friends, and that portrays and carries through a lot of different areas, such as preferences for unions, preferences for unionized corporations. Basically, whoever shares their worldview, they are the ones who are getting the meetings, they are the ones who are getting their bills through right now, and we have to do a better job of communicating with our friends and neighbors and being able to work together to change the direction of our state and get it back to more of a direction toward where we get more people wanting to live and start families and operate their businesses here. I apologize if I did not get to your stack of questions here. We will be in front for a while longer to talk with you individually. Please give a round of applause to our panelists.